on Symposium. Is the internet killing quality journalism and cheapening political debate? Chaired by a former recipient here of the Mary Cummins Award of Outstanding Achievement in the Media, well deserved I may say, is broadcaster and journalist Olivia O'Leary. So Olivia now, and this is going to be a fascinating, I think, and very topical debate. Okay? Take it from there.
That's really putting it up to me. Can I first say it's fantastic to see a room full of people who are interested in talking about the sort of issues that are close to our heart. When I was in at the earlier debate, I saw that pretty well every seat was taken, and I wondered would the same happen for this one, and it has. So listen, thank you all for coming. What we're going to be talking about will be following on a little bit from our last session, so wonderfully chaired by Katie Hannon. And what we're going to really talk about today is people have got used to not paying for news. This is a problem. It's a problem because the whole funding basis for journalism is being eroded. So that's what we're going to start about and talk about in this particular session. And I mean, people were being very optimistic earlier, so me maybe being slightly older, just a few things that I'd like to mention. The fact that in the United States, newsroom journalists have decreased by 1/3 in the period between 2006 and 2013. In this country, sales in daily newspapers were down by 4% in 2015, and this is a constant reduction. Now, we'll find out more about what's happening on online subscriptions later on. Sunday newspapers down by 6%. I'm talking obviously about print, but I'm not sure actually that online has caught up with that. Looking at advertising, in the United States, every 85 cents of every dollar spent on online advertising went to Google and Facebook in 2015. There are fewer people, and this was confirmed for me by the RTE News and Current Affairs people, fewer people watching news and current affairs. There's been a slow erosion. It isn't anything as bad as it is in other countries, but there has been a decline. So that's what's going on. That's what we have to deal with. And people can say an awful lot of what we're having to deal with is simply getting used to a new technology, as we've had to do since the days of Gutenberg, since revolutions like the motor car, so many times we've simply had to adapt. But this is a massive adaptation. And the sort of things that we want to look at in this particular session is how does quality journalism, monitored journalism, checked fact journalism survive and get funded in the internet age, when we know that most people between the ages of 18 and 24 now get their news on Facebook, for which they don't pay. Online companies, the Facebooks of this world, make money on the back of the sort of traffic that's generated sometimes by the monitored news that they pick up from the established news media. Facebook is thriving, Facebook makes money, the established media outlets are losing money. Monitored news outlets are at the moment losing money. There's an imbalance that we have to look at there. And if the future of factual, investigated and checked journalism is not assured, what happens to democracy? What happens to the sort of debates that we need to have on long-term things? Things that are going to matter in 5 and 10 and 15 years' time, in areas, for instance, like education. If it's impossible to have a really detailed, complicated discussion on a policy issue because everything is reduced to a tweet that says no water charges, what is going to happen in the future to our democracy and our politicians increasingly going to say, don't talk to me about this until after the election. Until the election, we're going to say nothing that gets us into trouble. Therefore, will there ever be a time where we can sit down and discuss intelligently and in the long term the sort of things that we need to talk about? And is democracy itself at risk at a time where wrong and sensational information can be put out there at the click of a switch And it can take so long, if it's wrong, to pull that back. And there are certain people who never realise that it was wrong in the first place. How do you have a proper debate in that situation? How do we make sure that online journalism, increasingly online journalism, which is unchecked, is held accountable? And what's going to happen to our society as a result? And I know I'm sounding a bit negative, but I want to quote somebody who's a very close friend and a very fine journalist, Robert Fisk, of The Independent, who's probably won every journalistic prize there is and continues to do it year after year after year. And maybe Bob was showing his age, and I know his age because it's very close to mine. And he said, to hell with the internet, it has no responsibility. And that, now, is that true? Is that not true? We'll be talking about some of that. But we want to first introduce our panel here this morning. We're delighted to have with us Professor Roy Greenslade. And Roy is Professor of Journalism at City University London. He has worked in senior positions in so many of the British newspapers, including The Sun and the Sunday Times, but he is a former editor of the Daily Mirror. He's now a leading commentator and columnist for the media and blogs for The Guardian. Sitting beside him is Genevieve Carberry, who's an assistant news editor with the Irish Times and theirishtimes.com. Genevieve previously worked with RTE.ie, the website, also with News Talk, and occasionally writes for international media like Time magazine. Sitting beside Genevieve is Mark Little. Mark, as you know, RTE's former Washington correspondent and primetime presenter indeed with Miriam O'Callaghan in his day, and somebody who recognised the changing face of journalism in the digital age and went and did something about it. So he set up Storyful, the first news agency of the social media age, discovering and validating content on the social web, and sold it in recent years to News Corp for 18 million, and is now running, Mark, am I right? Mark Little News and Media?
No, I work for Twitter.
You're working at Twitter now, sorry.
So now I'm
okay.
employed.
He's now working at Twitter, and he'll tell us more about that in a little while. Anyway, sitting beside Mark is Sarah Carey, whom you know because she had a wonderful session here yesterday, columnist and broadcaster who writes for the Sunday Independent and the Evening Herald and presents the Talking Point show on News Talk. And sitting beside Sarah is Timmy Dooley, TD for Clare and Fianna Fáil spokesman for Communications, Environment and Natural Resources, and Timmy's website dubs him as a humble servant to the people of Clare. Roy, can we start with you? You've said, and I'm very conscious, if you don't mind me saying so, that you and I are of a similar generation, and probably even older than you are, Roy. So, you know, it may affect the way we see things. But you have said that quality journalism must survive if democracy is to survive. But how do we find a business model that allows quality journalism to survive, which finances it?
The easy questions always come first. Can I just say I'm at a bit of a disadvantage. I've never been a judge on a Ballybunion which is pretty awful. I thought the previous session, spoken by Miriam and Steve and Dervla and Mandy, was brilliant and absolutely set the scene. Can I start with a very sad story? For the first time this year, I did a lecture to undergraduates, which I don't usually do at my university. There were 69 in the room. And I asked them, how many of you read newspapers, printed newspapers? Zero. Not one. How many of you have bought a newspaper in your life? Zero. How many of you read newspapers online? 4 or 5, out of 69. In fact, when we dug down into it more, they did read newspapers online, but they didn't realise they were reading them online. They go to Facebook and they get links which take them to newspaper sites, but they're unaware of it. That was so incredibly, thoroughly dispiriting to me, 53 years a journalist, starting on newspapers, still loving the smell of newsprint, the feel of them. I think Tony O'Reilly once said that a newspaper is the best browser you can have. I think that is true. Why is it such a good browser? Because when you open it up, you see things you wouldn't read otherwise. And that's the real difference. Whereas online, you go to the things that you think you should be reading. Whereas when I open a newspaper, I'm not necessarily interested in this particular subject, but I go there anyway. And that can lead you on. And of course, I ought to say straight away, I was a very, to use the jargon, early adopter of the internet, a great enthusiast. I am very able in terms of the digital world in connecting. When I launched my blog on The Guardian 10 years ago, I said I'm a digital revolutionary. I boasted that I was loving this.
A warrior.
Why? Because I understood that we, the gatekeepers of knowledge, Steve referred to this about news being what we gave you, that news was always a kind of vertical thing, top-down journalism. Whereas I realized the internet, it was horizontal. That we were involved now in having a real conversation with people. They were telling us what was wrong, we were providing a forum, they were then arguing with each other, we were really stimulating. But the interesting, when you're in a revolution, you never know where it's going to go. A technological revolution, you go back to the Industrial Revolution, you didn't know where that would lead, and the same thing is true here. I think it was Derby who mentioned that we're only in the foothills. That's absolutely true. We never foresaw Facebook, we never foresaw Twitter. And that has changed the dimension, I think. And it is now, I believe, a genuine crisis, one that I didn't really perceive at the beginning. And that is, if 69 21-year-olds are not reading journalism, not reading the journalism they didn't know existed, the unknown unknowns in their world, of course, then we are really in a crisis of democracy in the sense that will they be informed enough to take the right decisions, whether at a local election or a national election, and are they not prey to what we've heard about, which is fake news, to sound bites, and I think Steve mentioned this word, propaganda. The propaganda that one member of the audience spoke about earlier about if you just simply even say something negative about something which is put out there, you are actually boosting the negative by the very repetition of it. So yes, to sum up that first question, I do believe there's a genuine crisis in getting people to read, and that crisis, and I'm saying this as an old man, that crisis is there in the young generation. I can't get my 3 grandsons to read a newspaper. They tell me what they read online. I'm really enervated by the fact that they do. They're intelligent young men and they do consume a lot of news, but at the same time, it's in a very restricted form. And they are, and the mixture, this is probably the most important thing, is we always had, going back to the dawn of newspapers which had entertainment mostly and information. And then we saw the mixture of the two, and most of our newspapers, whether they're serious or light, do have that mixture. But the interesting thing about the internet is the way in which it merges entertainment into information. Unless you make it entertaining enough, no one is going there. And I think a lot of serious journalism, and I try to make what I write entertaining, and the odd analogy, the odd bit of a joke, but most of the time you want people to really concentrate on a serious developing argument. And I'll finish with another depressing statistic. I can monitor roughly who, in terms of numbers, is reading what I write at The Guardian. We have something called an OFAN dashboard. I have it on all the time, and I can see how my articles are doing. And I think, God, I've got thousands of readers, I'm really pleased. Then I go to the statistic which says how long they read me. 36 seconds an article.
Oh, God.
How depressing can that be? And of course, as a quality journalist, I feel sad about that.
Yeah. Funny, just when you were talking about the demise of newspapers, and I know I sound like a dinosaur here, but I remember the very first time I had a front page story on the Irish Times with my byline on it. And I went down to the bowels of the old Irish Times building to wait for the presses to run. And there was the front page running with my byline on it, you know, from roller to roller. And the whole building, because it was an old building, I don't know whether you'd remember it way back then, Jen, because you're so much younger than me. But I remember the whole building shook. And I'll tell you, it was an orgasmic experience. And one which I can forget about ever feeling anymore. I'll have to find other orgasmic experiences. Jenny, just to pass it on to you, you're dealing every day with decisions in the paper between the paper and the online operation. And what Roy has described there it is a crisis. We'll come on to the whole detailed funding issue in a moment, but he's described this as a crisis. Now, do you see it as a crisis in journalism and in quality journalism, or do you simply see it as a challenge?
I think if I saw it as a crisis that wasn't possible to fix, then I don't think that I would, I think I'd go and get a new career. So I kind of have to be very positive about it, and I am very hopeful about it. I mean, what I see it is as we've been through a big period of flux. Obviously, some of it is to do with the advent of online journalism and social media, but we also saw big changes that came with the financial crisis and lots of slimming down of newsrooms. I actually see a lot of hope, because when I look at things, at the traffic that you were talking about, the online traffic, right? When I look at the traffic and what people want to read, actually, people like to read really long pieces. They like to read in-depth pieces. Yes, they like to read the fluffy pieces. But so often, a few days ago, we had a 3,000-word piece about a woman who went in a nursing home at 61. It was one of our most read pieces, and people were reading it for an average of 6 minutes. Do you know, and every day you see that the really in-depth pieces do get really well read, and do get really well read among subscribers. And so when you look at what people who subscribe to the website read versus people who just go on willy-nilly through Facebook, like people who are describing Roy, kind of get their media from everywhere. People who subscribe actually want really good quality journalism, want really in-depth pieces, and want stuff that needs time put into it. And if the figures of people reading, it's kind of basic economics. If people show that they want to read good stuff and that they're going to subscribe for that, well, then that's what the newspaper and the website are going to do, and what the newsroom is going to do. So I have hope.
Yeah. But you do have, I'm conscious that I'm speaking to you from the side of a big chasm, which is the generational gap. But for instance, you would notice on the website what gets clicked on, wouldn't you? And that would help to decide editorially what story you're going to put into the paper the next day. It's probably certainly as an editor, it's a new balancing act compared to, say, 20 years ago, when you would have been just using your editorial judgment and what you thought was important. And you're using your news values and your news judgment as you always did, and they're instilled in you. But also you're looking at what people are interested in, and I think that's not a bad thing. Like we see that people are more interested in, say, in the water crisis. They're more the water charges stuff. They're more interested in what actually happens. The Q&As we put up about what does this mean for me, all the little explainers, people love those. And the detail, the nitty-gritty of what it means, they're not as interested in the committee seemed to go on forever on water charges, and that debate seemed to go on forever, and people weren't that interested in it, but they were interested when there was an actual decision. And in a way, journalists can get caught up in the political debate that actually a lot of people don't really care about. What they care is what is actually happening. They don't care who has done a political U-turn or whatever. They just care what did they decide and how will it affect me, or how will it affect other people. So I think that is a positive thing, because it really helps. So in that way it does inform you, because you see actually people don't necessarily want the big political debate. What they want is Yes. Where does it leave me?
So you will see there's more, like online we do a lot of Q&As, and you will see those now going into the paper a lot more, and I think they're more readable, as well as all the details as well. So.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a very good point. I'm conscious of the fact that we probably did belong to a period where we journalists decided what was important and we told people about it. But for instance, Northern Ireland was the big story for most of my political career, and a fatigue developed among the public in terms of hearing about Northern Ireland. God, not more about the bombing, the shooting and whatever. And you'd say, but it's really important because it's only 100 miles up the road and it's on your island and it really matters. But for us, particularly on television, putting out a programme about Northern Ireland, and everybody would go, oh no, not a programme about Northern Ireland. And I was one of those people who would say, guys, this is really important. Now, I know the challenge really was for us to make that matter to people. That was our skill as journalists, that we should have been able to provide it. But I do worry about a situation where you find out what people want and you give it to them.
I think in a good newsroom with a good news editor, you do both.
Yeah.
And I don't think you give them everything they want. You don't just go with the numbers, but I think you can learn from what people want, but you also use your judgment. If a story is important, just because people don't necessarily click on stories about Syria doesn't mean that when there's a chemical attack that you don't put it on the front page. You still know that certainly in the Irish Times, the values of the Irish Times Trust still goes through to the website and still is instilled in everything. You still know what your job is, and it's was it Dermot who described earlier as some sort of a public service role. You still realise that there's a bigger issue at stake. So
and we'll come back to that, because in a way the question that hangs in the air there is how long one can continue to fund that sort of public-spirited journalism in the present climate. We'll come back to that. Mark, just to move on to you, do you see it as a crisis or a challenge?
It's a crisis on a scale. Historically, I would say, go back to the invention of the printing press, right? Gutenberg's Bible. It would have been the moment you would have thought that civilization began, because we could all now share ideas. It sparked the greatest, most violent period in human history, because suddenly people had to confront other ideas, and it scared the bejesus out of them. You think about instead of social media, a challenge, put in the word radio, or telephone, or telegraph, or television, and you'll get a sense of the historical nature of what we're living through right now. In the last 10 years, Facebook, Google, Twitter have emerged. It's the blink of an eye. We're only beginning, as I think you quoted Dermot as saying, the foothills. We're not even at the foothills. We're in this gentle incline. And when I think about that scale of the historic shift, we think about radio, which I think all of us will know is one of the most intimate mediums. I mean, think about it. It's inside your head. But radio emerged. Adolf Hitler used to stick radios in people's living rooms so his propaganda could be more effective. In 1994, the genocide of Rwanda started because of incitement on radio. The point is, when we think about Twitter or Google or the internet, it's not some disembodied entity. It's a technological platform that allows us to reach more people quicker in a way that we could never do before. So it has this revolutionary potential. With every revolution, it has dangers. And we're living through this incredible moment that we will tell our children, grandchildren about, where the good and the bad is in stark contrast, sitting right side by side. And I share your sexual excitement about journalism. I never thought I'd be in a public platform saying that. I remember my first front page story for the Sunday Business Post. I had James Morrissey leaning over my shoulder saying, "Make it sing," at 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday as it went to press. I remember Anne Doyle speaking to her on a mobile phone the size of a suitcase from a prison riot in Phibsborough. But I also remember, as a foreign correspondent, it wasn't that authentic being out in the field. You had to hire cars and translators and drive in the middle of nowhere, place like Afghanistan and Iraq, and you'd hear third hand in a local dialect interpreted through somebody who would tell you something. You would go to a satellite dish and then tell people back in Ireland who would kind of get bored and switch over to Coronation Street. The good old days weren't that good. So along came Twitter, and suddenly somebody who'd been in the field frustrated that I couldn't really get this picture across to people. I was seeing from places like Tahrir Square in Egypt, this revolutionary, intimate, authentic, first-person account of what was happening on the ground. And I suddenly said to myself, and I remember Sean O'Rourke saying I was having a midlife crisis or a breakdown when I started and left primetime. The thing was, I was struck by the fact that I was engaging with real people. When I was preparing for a primetime interview, for example, I would go out there and ask people questions. What should I ask tonight? can you tell me a little bit more about water charges, or whatever the subject was, I would get from people who knew something more than I did about that subject, really informed questions and engagement, and suddenly I realized there was this equal relationship that I was seeing that so excited me, so much so that I started up a news agency. So what I've lived through is building a business model on this sense that on social media, your currency as a journalist is about your engagement with the individual, not your status, authority, or whatever particular anchor position you hold. That was the positive part of it. The negative part, I think, in the second wave of the rise of social media, which I would characterize by the dominance of Facebook and Google, is an implosion in trust. That is, our belief in sort of a set of collective facts we can all agree on. But more serious, an implosion of trust. Because, as I think Roy said earlier on, everything now is coming at us in one single stream of content. It is the pictures from your kid's birthday right beside a well-researched piece of journalism about the prison system in the United States. It's all priced the same, it's all fed through the same tube, you have no way of distinguishing it. And I think that's the core problem we have right now, as well as information overload at an historic level. Our brains are fried every day. Americans consume 5 times more information online today than they did online and offline 20 years ago. Our neural networks are fried, and therefore we end up turning back to the crowds that we trust. And that's where this filter bubble comes from. In all of this, I would say, if I was predicting where journalism will go in terms of the economic model, if you're dependent on Facebook or Google or programmatic advertising, which is essentially an automated way of allocating prices to content, you're dead in the water. The only way forward for journalism is to rebuild a direct connection with the individual citizen. Now, it will have to be paid for. But the idea that people won't pay for news just because they don't pay for news today, I think is self-defeating. And I think, from my point of view, someone who's built a business on the internet is missing a remarkable opportunity to redefine the relationship between the journalist and the individual, which was lost, I think, before the rise of the internet, when you had programs like Primetime competing with the Champions League for the same advertising dollar, which has dropped, or the advertising euro. So I think, personally, I've never been more excited to be a journalist and an entrepreneur as well, because I think that the crisis we're going through is producing new opportunities to redefine the relationship of journalism with the citizen. As long as we can find ways to pay for the public utility that is journalism, with the personal service that is also journalism. Because remember, the Baghdad Bureau never made money. Serious journalism never made a cent.
Yeah. Okay, and we're going to talk about actual funding in a moment. Sarah, just to come to you on the issue, do you see it as a crisis or a challenge?
Well, hi. First of all, I'd like to apologise for the state of my voice.
She was singing until 2:30 this morning.
I was very privileged a couple of years ago. I was sent on a week-long course to the Harvard Business School to do an executive education course on the future of media and how you make all this work. And one of the things they did was they put up this chart, which I have hastily tried to reproduce here. It's a downward sloping curve of newspaper readership, so but no timeline on the bottom. And they said to us, what year would you put on this? What do you think was the year that newspaper readership really started to crash? And people were saying, I don't know, the 70s, the 80s, maybe 95, maybe when YouTube started. I said, no, 1880. Like, the golden age of the time when everybody got their readership from newspapers was a very long time ago. And as Mark was saying, the things that came along and disrupted that were radio, the telegraph, television. All of these platforms came along that gave people a new way of getting their news and caused this huge crisis for the newspaper industry. So, in one sense, I feel maybe there's a little bit of alarm, about this. It was always thus. The other interesting thing they said was the single biggest cost for newspapers is the cost of printing the paper. It's a huge, massive fixed cost on their bottom line. The day we print the last newspaper is the day the newspaper industry can start to make money again. So it will be online, you'll be reading it on the tablet, on your screen or whatever, but when we accept that we don't have to go down to the shop and buy that paper and all it costs to print and get into that shop. That's a whole cost factor that just disappears. Now, the question is, how long will that take? Will that be 5 years, 10 years, 30 years? We don't know. But in many ways, while that day may be seen as doomsday for those who adored the printing presses and hot ink or something they called it, actually, then we've got a business model we can start to work with. I thought it was a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
In terms of what people want, and this idea that they're only reading, you know, the newspaper article for, 36 seconds, which is probably pretty good. They talk about leaning in and leaning back. So when you're in front of a computer screen, you're leaning in, you know, like this, and maybe you don't have that much time to read stuff. When tablets came out, it made long-form online journalism viable again, because people could lean back and read it like they were reading a magazine. It was very important, for example, for The Economist, you know, which a newspaper that, or a magazine that often had long essays. They realised that this was an opportunity for them. So I don't necessarily sign up to this is all a complete disaster.
Yeah.
And I know on my own radio programme, I always say, look, I'll never be a Miriam, I'll never be a Morning Ireland. I'm not into the kind of journalism where I'm challenging a politician and determined to get you, you know, on a particular point. What I do on my programme is, it's called explainer journalism. And I'm trying to understand what's going on. And there is a huge market for that, and we see that in the long-form journalism that is going on. Magazines like The Atlantic, you know, all these big essays. I think there is a huge hunger from people to understand, as opposed to expose and humiliate, or what might be more nicely called challenge.
Okay.
That market is there, and I don't think actually it's been fully served, particularly in broadcasting.
And that interesting,
broadcasting.
interesting what Genevieve said earlier about the question and answer format and how popular that is both online and in the paper. Timmy, coming to you, and I'm going to come back to the big question I really want to ask is how we're going to fund quality journalism. But Timmy, do you see a crisis, and do you see it as a crisis which affects democracy and affects the political world that you move in?
Well, I think I see it more as a challenge than a crisis, and I certainly think there is the potential for a very significant impact on democracy. And I think just to go back to the last debate, which I had the opportunity to listen to, the concerns about the emergence of fake news and the lack of interest in truth, or the lack of interest in the association of a brand. You take the mainstream brands that we're familiar with, if it's read in the Times, the Independent, the mainstream media, it's on RTE. There's an acceptance by a certain group of us that the facts are well researched, that the provenance of it is solid, and we take it as fact. But you're right, and I mean the discussion has been I think Roy made the point about his university class. I see that amongst my own children and those that are a little bit older, my nieces and nephews. They have no interest in mainstream media. They will provide you with information that they believe to be factual because the brand to them is the platform. And yet, you take Facebook, you take Google, they kind of take a hands-off approach. They're happy to have the content on there.
Of course
for them, it's just a facilitation. This is how it's presented. Yeah. But unfortunately, a younger generation see it as the brand, which there's an association of it being a solid brand, it's recognisable, and therefore it must be truthful. And I was taken to some extent by, somebody mentioned it earlier about Mark Zuckerberg. For a long time you said this is an open platform, allows everybody to communicate, and that's how it should be. It's a community conversing with each other. When he saw the fallout from that Stevens murder online 6 or 7 days ago in Cleveland, he was very quick to react. He was very quick to indicate that there could be technological advances that would facilitate the protection of his brand, because the first time, for perhaps the first time, there was such a level of outrage. And then you look at it in terms of, say, what Fox have done in the last number of days with Bill O'Reilly. Why did they move to deal with somebody so important? Because 50 advertisers said, this just isn't acceptable. Yeah. We're not prepared to continue. Now, it's not that that I think the advertisers necessarily thought it was going to impact negatively on their brands. But somebody there figured out that's the right thing to do. So there's a challenge to all of us.
No, they thought it would impact negatively on the brands too.
They may do, but I like to think there's a little bit more to it than that, and I like to think that perhaps society at a point, and this is the challenge to all of us, that society starts to reflect on, in terms of the quality and the bona fides of the information they're being provided with. And if so, are they prepared to pay for it? Are they prepared to pay for it, as Mark has said, in terms of paying a subscription for the news, or are they through general taxation prepared?
Well, now there's a question.
Yeah,
do you think in fact we're moving to a period when in general taxation, just like we're going to pay for water through general taxation, that there is going to have to be some sort of a tax to subsidise quality journalism?
I do actually, and I've recently submitted a document on behalf of our party to a sort of a communication that's going on within our committee around how you fund public service broadcasting. At the moment it's just looking at broadcasting. I'm of the view that there should be a public service broadcast charge based on a household.
And what you do, add it to the property tax? Well, you can't.
Well, you can do that, and you can allow the revenue commissioners to collect it if you so wish. There's a myriad of ways of collection. I actually think 86% of the population are paying for it already. So it's not, I mean, there was some negativity, I think, in the mind of the current minister when he came to power. Because in fairness to Pat Rabbitt and Alex White, they'd done a lot of work on this, and they were quite a way down the road. Dennis Naughton chose not to proceed with it because of the negativity around the water charge. Now, water charge is an entirely new concept. We won't get into that today.
Oh God, no.
It was an entirely new concept, and you hadn't a big take-up. But if 86% of the population are currently paying...
Timmy, that's a fib. You had a massive take-up.
That's fake news, is it?
Yes.
But it went down to 56%, so it was just a little bit over half. But with the license fee, something like 86% are paying, 14% aren't. I like to think that the 86% who are willfully going to their post office or wherever, they're purchasing their TV license. Yeah. They believe there's a benefit. They do so. Yeah. Chances of getting caught, I think, are relatively limited. So they choose to do it. Now, how can you broaden that? How can you broaden that charge? Okay. How can you support? Now, the French do this very well. The French support their print media. Now, I'm not hung up on the idea of it remaining necessarily in the printed environment, but the challenge is to the print organisations to develop their online platforms. Now, they need support to do that. Yeah. I think, as Mark has indicated, they probably need to believe and see the opportunities and the future in that particular realm, which they've kind of almost given up.
Just wanted to stick in one quick point. Subscriptions to the New York Times have rocketed since Donald Trump got elected. Yeah. With the people awake, it turned out they actually were prepared to pay. So it may not be a downward slide.
How do we fund quality journalism? You've spoken a bit about this, Roy, and you've quoted Justin Schlossberg of London University, who has suggested that there be a levy on companies like Facebook, which will, I suppose, a tax, a levy, whatever you want to call it, which will then finance or help to finance or subsidise monitored journalism, because websites like that are managing to get profits on the basis of the traffic that is promoted by other people's monitored journalism work.
Yeah, this is the idea that the parasites who are living off us should pay something towards the fact that
That's right, Roy, don't sit on the fence.
And we are the goose that lays the golden egg. The golden egg is content, and that if they are using our content, then they should in some way reward us for having produced it. But let me outline the possibilities here. I think the advertising model has not yet passed, but the advertising model of funding newspapers is virtually over. I think that is quite clear. We're seeing advertising move to, in their view, a better landscape, which is largely Facebook and Google. Not yet Twitter properly, but anyway, that's where they're going. And so, literally, our business model is in decline. and it's almost, Sarah's right that there's been a long-term decline in newspapers, although in Britain I would say that the 1960s were the zenith in circulations, and you can see them go down dramatically after that. But the important thing is that that decline suddenly accelerates around about 2005, and it's really very bad in the last 5 years again. So that papers that relatively felt comfortable, like the Telegraph in Britain, like the Guardian in Britain, are now feeling distinctly uncomfortable for the first time. So there's the advertising model. Then there is the subscription model. Again, Sarah made reference to that. The New York Times have made a success of it. Somebody in the last panel mentioned the Financial Times, which is rightly, of course, because it's such a useful thing, and it's only read by an affluent elite, and the affluent elite, it's no cost to them to pay for it, so that works. In Britain, we've seen Murdoch decide that the Times should be funded by subscription. And that, against all my forecasts that he was wrong, he turns out to be right. It has actually worked rather well for the Times in Britain. But the interesting thing is he did the same for the Sun, and it didn't work. And that's one of the questions we need to ask. Are we gradually producing a journalism which is only for an elite? You touched on this, Steve, and this is the classic thing. Are we gradually having a quality of journalism which is not read by those who basically give up? Maybe my 69 undergraduates, I don't know. They are intelligent, and I want to say positively on their behalf, I read their essays before I came here, and their essays are very good. So it's not as if they're not lacking in intelligence or even in information, but it comes in a different way. So it's advertising, subscription, philanthropy. Don't forget that at the dawn of newspapers, philanthropy was really important. The Guardian was founded by philanthropy. Many newspapers were founded in that way, and we've seen really interesting investigative journalism sites. ProPublica in the States, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in Britain, and others, and across the world, being founded by people who think, I'm going to put my money behind public service journalism and make it work.
Yeah.
So philanthropy's there.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to finish on this, on the levy.
Yeah.
Okay, but so we should have, what I think is, we will have, and we probably always had this, a mixed economy, in which probably advertising plays a smaller part than it's ever done before. But right now, those that are advertising funded certainly are also in hoc to advertisers. So the closing down of Bill O'Reilly, thank God that he was pushed off. Remember also that Rupert Murdoch closed the News of the World for the very same reason, the removal of advertising. We don't want to give power back to advertisers, but what we do want is to ensure that there is a model which enables enough journalists to gather together. That's the other important thing, not as satellites all out there working alone. We want the gathering of journalists, ideas not between journalists, in a central hub that provides a proper form of journalism which does hold that phrase again, power to account.
I'm going to go to Mark and then to Genevieve. Mark, just as somebody who is an entrepreneur who's gone out there and taken a risk in terms of setting up an agency and whatever, talk to me about funding and how you see the future funding of quality journalism.
So I'm in a strange position. I've worked for Rupert Murdoch. I've worked for the Irish taxpayer. I work for myself. I've worked for Jack Dorsey. So I've taken checks from all those different people. I've seen all their models up close and personal. I find myself something like talking science fiction when I start to talk about the details of what we're actually discussing here, because when you describe the broken system we have, it's really, really important to try and understand a little bit more about how news comes to you through a place like Facebook, right? It goes into an algorithm, which is a computer program, right? Which is saying, I know you. I know the bag you bought last week.
Yeah.
I know how many friends you have. I know what you generally like to do on a Saturday. And I'm going to rank all the content coming through this big pipe on the basis of what I think you're going to like. And it's all going to be about emotion. It's trying to provoke an emotion in you that makes you buy something. And all that's to do with an advertising platform underneath it, which is basically automated. And it's tiny amounts of money going toward ads. That's why, the Irish Times is put in the same bucket as some crazy fake news site from Macedonia. So that system is broken. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in Harvard, and the guy stood up and said, why don't we have just ad blockers on all new iPhones to force the newspaper industry, the publishing industry, to just break their dependence on this essentially quite toxic business model that they've been forced to depend on. The second thing is, what if we said, okay, subscription, we talk about the idea of paying for news. The current way you subscribe to a newspaper online is crazy. I mean, who buys individual sort of subscriptions to a newspaper, then the next newspaper, the next newspaper? Why don't we have a Netflix for news? Why don't we have a bundle of different things, the way we go online? We might pay for the Irish Times, a bit of the Financial Times, a bit of Sports Digest we like. The concept that we will have these single brands that will demand your money for their service is crazy. Now, I know it sounds science fiction, but there's a lot of really interesting
So
new
you're
models.
talking about the blending, the amalgamation of a number of different news organisations.
Yeah, I'm not against the idea of taxpayer-funded journalism. I believe in that very strongly. Journalism as a public utility, i.e. local news of importance to you as a citizen, is never going to make money. It has to be subsidised somehow, whether it's by the taxpayer or by the money you make off journalism as a personal service, trading on your devotion to a football team or your love of a TV programme. That's where you make the money that subsidises the rest of the model. It's always been that way. And I think, just to give you a couple of science fiction ideas, right? One thing I'm working on at the moment myself personally is the idea that we'll have what we call micropayments. That you'll have a wallet when you go online and you look at something and go, I really like that, I want to read that, and automatically, like phone credit, 20 cent drops in an article. Or tipping. In Asia right now, we're seeing the surge in people reading an article and then saying, you know what, I like that so much, I'm going to drop 10 cent on the article or give it to the brand or the newspaper. So we have a whole series of new innovative ways of paying for journalism that resemble phone credit or Netflix, all the other ways in your life that you pay for essential services. And the idea that we're going to be seeing the subscription bounce after Trump for all these serious newspapers as being the way forward, I think is a little short-sighted. It is so exciting what we potentially could be doing with these new ways of paying for news, but we're still stuck in this fear of the big bad Facebook, which I think is a problem.
Genevieve, can I come back to you, because you work for a traditional monitored news organisation, and to take up some of the things that Mark is talking about there. If we're talking about a subscription which is maybe 3 times what the present subscription to the Irish Times per month would be, which it seems to me may have to be the case as less and less advertising is available to newspapers, does that divide us into the people who can afford or want to do that and are well informed, and then a whole group of people within a society who are not informed and who either won't or can't pay? Is that the problem with relying simply on a subscription model?
Do you not think there has always been a divide? Like with newspapers, the cover price of the Irish Times has always been far above the cover price of a lot of tabloids, and a lot of tabloids would have, their appeal would have been not just their populism, but also their cover price, which you'd often see 50p or whatever on the front of, I can't remember which tabloid. But I think there has always been a divide, and there has always been a divide between who reads broadsheet newspapers and who reads tabloids, or who reads nothing at all and just pick up whatever they can from radio or other sources. So I don't necessarily feel that is such a big problem.
It's certainly not a new problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Obviously it's not democratic,
Yeah.
it's not idealistic, but I don't think it's a new.
What about what Roy was talking about earlier, which is a levy on companies, say, like Facebook, which make massive profits, very often on the basis of traffic generated by the work done by journalists like you and me? What do you think about a levy?
I think it's a lovely idea, but I just don't think it would ever.
But if it could be
happen.
done, do you think it should be done? or is it a matter that you're so convinced that it couldn't be done that there's no point going there?
Yeah, I cannot see how it would work. But I mean, maybe there are big ideas that I just can't see. But I cannot see that working. At the moment, Facebook just seems just seems so big to me and so powerful that really we are reliant on Facebook for providing a certain amount of traffic to our website.
Yeah.
You know.
So you don't see Facebook as a parasite. You see Facebook as an opportunity to advertise your paper.
Oh no, Facebook. I'm not. I don't necessarily like that people get their news from Facebook. But maybe I just have to be hopeful, you see. And so I just see that, I see it as an opportunity sometimes to reach people you would never reach otherwise.
Yes.
So, and maybe that you're reaching people who would not have picked up the Irish Times in the past. So,
in fairness, I think there's something to be said that there is a relationship in which we pick up news from Facebook as journalists. So there is a relationship, and it's also true that Facebook could open people's eyes by reading the Irish Times when they hadn't previously done. But I think you've got to see that is a minor sport, a minor matter in comparison with what really gradually Facebook is doing, which is driving us down and down and down. But I also think, in relation to the levy, I'll just finish on this, sorry, is that Zuckerberg has shown himself, especially of late, and especially because everyone thinks he's going to run for the presidency, he's shown himself much more open to the idea that he needs to do something about Facebook in terms, obviously, of violence, and in terms of pornography. And I think also he could bend over the matter of his algorithmic theft of our intellectual property.
And maybe open to accountability. Sarah?
One interesting parallel actually is the telecommunications industry. They're going through this exact war with Google as well. Because the old system for telecoms was, I sold you a phone, you made phone calls on it, and you paid me for those phone calls. Now I sell you the phone, you download WhatsApp, and you're contacting all your friends for free, and I'm getting nothing for it. And actually, Dennis O'Brien's Digicel company tried to throw off some of the messaging apps in the Caribbean countries, and they weren't let do it. The regulator wouldn't let do it. But there's a feeling amongst the telecommunications companies, they're in the same boat as newspapers. Google's stealing, Skype, all of these companies stealing their lunch. And they need to get together and actually just say, no, you can't stop doing this. You have to pay us something because we're what's called the dumb pipe. In relation to a levy, I'm very happy to pay my TV licence fee. I think RTE, by and large, does an extremely good job. And I have no grudge against that. I know many of my colleagues do, and it's a disgrace, and it's this extra tax. So I've no problem funding broadcasting either by a separate fee or through general taxation. However, I would absolutely balk some of that money going to newspapers. Because a lot of the newspapers, I don't like their politics. And a lot of the newspapers, I don't like their product. I don't like the way they actually do journalism. And it would sicken me if I had to pay for those. And right, probably because we're all here media, we're all saying, oh, we do this amazing job and it's not fair. Someone should pay for us, to keep doing our jobs. A lot of journalism is really bad, even in the so-called quality newspapers, and I see it all the time. On any subject I know actually anything about in depth, and I have a background in technology and some other things, I'll see it in the paper and it's just reported all wrong. Or in cases like water rates, or when there's a big political row, this hysteria, where clearly the top priority is just to get someone to resign. And there's no interest in actually, or if it is, it's deep buried on the inside pages. The priority is the scandal, get somebody. Journalism is trusted so badly by the public, and when they get people to do surveys, well, who do you trust? Judges, lawyers, priests. Journalists are at the bottom. And I'd really say, you know what?
I thought we beat lawyers. I thought.
We're below the lawyers. And I see it all the time, and I wouldn't like to pick out now particular articles in particular papers because I don't want to pick on my colleagues. But usually by omission, usually by not explaining something properly, something is explained quite wrong, and usually to the detriment of a particular person and to the detriment of democracy. So this kind of pious attitude that we're fantastic for democracy and therefore you should fund us, I think requires a little more self-reflection and a little more determination to do your job
take that one
properly.
step forward. I totally agree with what Sarah said, but can I just ask you to consider for a moment, right? We're being asked to choose between serious, good journalism and the horrors of Facebook. Yeah. Underlying this is a toxic business model in which all of you are the product. You're the commodity. The newspapers and Facebook are selling your attention to advertisers, and you don't even know it because it's all hidden behind the platforms you use. As long as journalism depends on reaching all of you as some great big collective audience of eyeballs for a single fleeting moment, we will have mistrust in journalism, and the business model for journalism will not work. Until journalism finds a way to re-establish contact with you and you and you and every single one of you as individuals, and you work out the value for the journalism you provided, we will have not only, I think, distrust in journalism, but we will have no future economically for journalism, because we will be killed by the economic imperative of this.
But Mark, if the way of establishing contact with you as an individual is the sort of algorithms that, remember that you tried to look for a leather handbag 4 months ago and the goddamn leather handbag follows you for months and months and months afterwards, and you suddenly realise that this is the sort of stuff you're being fed. I worry about the notion of people being totally treated as individuals, because that means individual consumers.
But I'll give you another way of looking at it. The reason the bag, your purchase, is noted by Facebook is because they want you to buy another bag. What if the algorithm said, you're a commuter who travels from some part of Dublin or Limerick every morning at the same time, and I need to feed you the information of weather, traffic, public transport, which can all be automated, because I've identified you have a need. Not a consumer interest, but a need as a citizen. And machines, and this is what's great about artificial intelligence, I know it's scary stuff, but it has an incredible civic purpose. If we can automate the stuff that journalism shouldn't be worried about, the weather, I mean the stuff that you need to know about can be given to you through these algorithms. And then the context, the important storytelling that happens is the stuff that we can value for journalism. And that's, I think, where these algorithms, this automation can be absolutely liberating. And
so it's about the resetting of the algorithms.
It is.
Why does this not fill my heart?
To identify your vital interest as a citizen, as a voter, as a taxpayer, as a parent, not your preferences as a consumer.
I think what Mark is saying is fantastic when we get there. But we're in that flux period where, you know, as a society, we were very careful about the information that we gave people previously. Like, I come from rural Ireland. People didn't tell others, their neighbours, about their lives. Now, your friends show up on Facebook and they're giving you the most intimate detail about what they're doing every day, and you're going, where did all that come from?
Do I need to know?
Well, I certainly don't. But the reality is that I think so. Some of that has to bed down. People have to get over the sort of interest in what the technology can do until it moves to where Mark's going. The question I have is, how do we sustain journalism, quality journalism, until such time as we get a better, more mature understanding of what the technology provides, so that the technology is a provider for us.
And your answer to that question, to me, certainly for the moment, is the financing of public service broadcasting.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's where we have to support it. And I take the point that Sarah makes, that she doesn't want to fund certain
and would you agree with
media outlets. No, I wouldn't, because I think there's a way to do it. I think if you look at what the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland do at the moment with the licence fee, a large chunk of it goes to RTE under set criteria and provisions, and they've got to meet those standards. Some of the money goes into the Sound and Vision Fund, where, you know, different organisations can apply for funding for a specific purpose. I'm of the view that local radio should also be supported in that way for specific provision of local news and current affairs, not in competition with RTE, but news and current affairs which local radios find really difficult to produce because it's costly, and it's the match that's on in Ballyhide this evening that people want to hear about, or it's some other arts event that's on down in wherever. Really important information that might be lost if we don't support it. I think what Mark talks about is the future. The gap in the middle for me is where we could lose, we could lose the really important infrastructure that we've there.
Okay.
It's like you look at journalism, and I'll finish with this point. What do you say to somebody at the moment who say, I want to be a journalist? The landscape is bleak in terms of getting a good job at an early stage when you come out of college. So how do we give support to allow the journalistic endeavour to continue and ensure that we have a steady pipeline of people who are interested in its provision?
The discussion was fascinating. Facebook, my personal experience is that Facebook is now populated by middle-aged people and grannies keeping in touch with their kids overseas, and our teenagers have left Facebook and don't use Facebook, and they're using private closed groups on WhatsApp or on Snapchat in order to communicate. So I wonder, are we overestimating the power of Facebook that may die with us?
But they are different. We say social media, it's like saying newspapers, like it's so different. WhatsApp, Snapchat, WeChat.
A lot of the time that comes, particularly in politics, from a gender-wise. And I think a lot of what I see, and I see it in student politics as well as like national and international, is that there are facts, there is truth, but there's a choice being made in which stories are being told. And a lot of the time, you know, we won't focus on, you know, if a man has a new toupee or if he's wearing a Dunn suit or a Rena suit, but we'll very much focus on if the woman is wearing too much makeup, if her legs are out, and if her heels are too high. And I can't help but wonder if a lot of that is coming from, as well as social media, and the fact that a meme will travel a lot further than a news story will. So when we see a meme of Angela Merkel's legs, we will see Justin Trudeau countering Trump's handshake.
And particularly where the comments on social media are anonymous, that it's almost as though license has been given to be increasingly racist and sexist in a way that we had thought wasn't possible anymore.
Yeah, there's no doubt that that's the case, and politicians or public figures generally find themselves on the butt end of a lot of those negative comments from people who are and can remain anonymous. But that's not necessarily a new phenomena. Comments were scrawled on the back of the toilet doors when we were in school.
So you're basically saying that social media is the equivalent of the graffiti and the loo.
It has provided a platform that has a much greater level for people to view and see, and it obviously can be a hell of a lot more upsetting to certain individuals. But I also think that you got to get to a point where you ignore some of this, certainly from a politician's point of view.
But sometimes to ignore it, Timmy, to ignore it, you have to simply not go there. I remember a young person saying to me, Olivia, do you know every time you do a column and you say that people should pay their water charges, do you know what the vitriol is like on social media? And I said, no, because I don't read it. Yeah. Now, you can't do that, because being a politician, I assume you feel you have to be a participant, you have to be out there. So you don't have any choice in terms of allowing a lot of this bile and poison to wash over you.
I tend to respond to people who direct mail me on Twitter or on Facebook or
named people.
To my page. Named people who will send a message. But if you go into the comments, for sure, and you were to read them, I do on occasion, and I ignore it. But my kids get upset if they read it, and families get upset, and I know how that plays out. But at the same time, it's not all negative from a politics point of view either, the whole social media exercise. You look to what Donald Trump succeeded in doing. He used social media to great effect to present himself to an audience that he wouldn't have been able to achieve through the traditional media. So, whilst the impression is given that social media, Facebook, whatever, is a negative from a public image point of view, from a political point of view, it can be used by politicians who have a brass neck, and maybe we all have brass necks.
Have you such a brass neck?
But have a particular breed of brass neck that they ignore all of that and they continue to bombard, and if they're sufficiently well resourced and they use all the algorithms and they've access to the technology and the creation and the presentation and and all that, so they can steer the news in a way that benefits.
And they can grab attention. One of the contributors in the last session, I thought, made a very important point about the big pictures of Trump in the newspapers standing with the American flag behind him. And I remember thinking that at the time. You know the old saying, there's no such thing as bad publicity. Every politician, and you included, would say that political posters, which I think are such a pain in the face, political posters are really important because of the recognition factor. So if it works in terms of your posters around every telegraph pole in County Clare, it obviously must have worked the same for Donald Trump.
Yeah, but I think posters, just to deviate amongst the same thing, posters are fantastic for your first election to get name recognition, but I'm always taken by politicians who are around a while, myself included, who say, we should do away with posters because it ensures the next wave of politicians don't get the benefit of having their mug plastered everywhere and getting them instantly recognised. But yes, there is that issue. But to go back to the Trump issue, I think the biggest issue there, which mainstream media missed, was he was seen as a joke figure. They didn't interrogate what he was saying. They saw him to some extent as a joke candidate. they looked at it in terms of news rather than current affairs. So it was every time he pulled a stunt, it was a news item, and it was right that would be covered. And I would disagree with somebody in the audience who talked about that before. It should have been covered, absolutely. But the piece that was missing was the interrogation and the analysis and the investigative journalism that really only started to come at the end.
Yeah.
Who was this person? Why isn't why doesn't he want us to see his taxes?
Okay, Sarah, you've been waiting.
But just one thing on the Twitter. I actually only joined it last year, but I have been watching it all the time. The abuse is actually outrageous. Now, they tell you should have a thick skin, or don't look at it, or stuff like that. But I find if I make any comment, and water charges is one, they come for you. It's absolutely unbelievable. And I don't have a thick skin. And it meant that about 6 months ago I was actually asked to go on primetime to talk about water charges. And I said to the researcher, you know what? This week I'm actually just not up for it, because I knew what would come. And it's stuff like, you're a vile and disgusting individual, you should be in jail, the bitch, C word, all of this, like really nasty. I wish I had the self-discipline to not look at it. I wish I had what you had. There's something screwed up, kind of addictive about taking a peek to see what's there. And my kids are reading it too.
I work for Twitter, and I know behind closed doors, things I can't talk about, obviously, but at the same time, the depth of commitment from the most diverse group of people, by the way, working on this problem day and night about abuse. You have to understand, we're in an arms race right now. The forces of democracy, free speech unleashed, to give people a chance to compete for their voice to be heard from places like Egypt or Syria at the moment. And these trolls, anonymous hate figures, sometimes motivated by political agendas. The arms race between the good and the light, that is exactly what we're engaged in right now. And there is a lot of effort being put on the idea of giving people powers and tools to protect yourself from that kind of abuse. We are not there yet. I'm not defending necessarily the lack of pace about this. These are big problems, and we basically only have them for a space of a blink of an eye in terms of our history. So that applies, I think, to a lot of things we've talked about today. But the people dealing with the issues in Twitter, Facebook, small group of people who are running at 100 miles an hour to keep up with something that has unintended consequences they never imagined. Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey did not want to be the biggest news publishers in the world 10 years ago, sitting in their small garages, basements, and offices in San Francisco. Catching up to that reality is a challenge that can't just be left to them. And that's why I'd say to all of you, instead of cursing the
My
Congress,
heart bleeds for these reluctant Genevieve, just to come to you, and I'm going back to something that we talked about earlier, that image of Donald Trump with the flag behind him. And every newspaper, it wasn't just the Irish Times, every newspaper printed this. And I do remember at the time looking at it and thinking, does there come a point where journalists decide, if we do give him publicity, we make it as a little bit more balanced. Those massive big pictures were in themselves a promotion of Trump. Did you have that sort of debate within the Irish Times as to how to handle the Trump phenomenon, and the consciousness that every time an enormous image of Trump went up, it perhaps promoted him rather than focused attention on his weaknesses?
But I suppose you're going to have it less about Trump when you're the Irish Times, because you would have it if it was an Irish election, but because I suppose you don't feel that you're influencing US voters necessarily. However, I think the Trump phenomenon, I don't remember those conversations, but that doesn't mean they didn't happen, but I don't remember them. I think the Trump phenomenon just took everybody by surprise. The polling showed it, I certainly presumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win.
She did.
In terms of popular vote, yes.
So I don't think anybody. I think it took everybody by surprise. I think it took media by surprise, and I think that, I suppose, maybe Trump played everybody a bit, because he was, his story, or he was so appealing in terms of a news story, but you kind of presumed that everybody realised that what he was saying was off the wall, and that you really wouldn't trust this guy as president. I don't think anybody here really thought that that people would vote for.
Yeah, I came back from the States, having spoken to in-laws in the States, and I was horrified at the number of educated middle-class people who were going to vote for. But I agree, Jenny, when I came home, and as August went on and into September, and I was reading the various, polls showing Hillary ahead, I began to doubt myself and say, well, maybe it isn't going to happen. So that when it did happen, once again, I was surprised. Yeah. I won't stand here and say I knew all the time. I kept changing my mind on it. Coming back to where the future is. And I agree with you that without trusted news sources, democracy will suffer and we descend into some sort of chaos. What do you think is the first thing we need to do now? Do we need to do what Rupert Murdoch did? And God knows I'm not somebody to be complimenting Rupert Murdoch, but to simply say, we're bringing down the paywall, you're going to have to pay for it, end of story.
Let me take up something, I'll answer that in taking up something that Sarah said, which was about how she doesn't want to see any kind of levy go to current newspapers because of the nature of newspapers, the nature of their owners, the nature of their politics. And I agree. I see that the levy should go to public service journalism. And that is happening in a really interesting way in the UK. It has been decided that the BBC should fund 150 reporters across Britain to take up the slack because local newspapers and the local newspaper industry is on its knees. It doesn't have enough staff to cover courts, coroners' inquests, and council meetings. So these 150 reporters will be funded, and that levy, when you think about it, when you think about the BBC license fee, when you think about the RTE license fee, it is through those license fees that we could add to them. No one wants to have a tax. I thought Timmy was quite funny talking about a tax because every opposition politician always likes tax, and when they get into government they don't. Cheap shot, Timmy, but anyway. The truth is we have, through our funding of public service broadcasting, a mechanism in which we could fund other forms of journalism, written forms, online forms of journalism, and it seems to me that we could go that route without any problem. And to take up also the extremely good point made by Mark, and that is that micropayments through bundling, so that I could get 10 articles from the Times, 10 from the Financial Times, 10 from the Telegraph, and 10 from the FT, and so on, 10 from the Irish Times, and you could cross boundaries with that, and you've got your 60 things you get for free, then you add to your micropayments after that. That seems to me to be the way ahead. I'm very frustrated that I want to read The Australian, and it means I've got to pay Rupert Murdoch money to do that. I hate paying Rupert Murdoch any money of any kind, although he was very generous to me when I worked for him, but anyway, that's beside the point. I think there are ways that we can make sure public service journalism exists in the future, and that's for the good of society as a whole.
Okay, and in fact, I'm going to give the last word to Genevieve, because somebody said earlier, you should always have on the panel a recently qualified journalist. Now, you're well qualified, I know, but you're by far the youngest person on this particular panel. And I think what I want to say is, I'm probably of the generation that sees the gloomy side of this argument, that sees quality journalism disappearing, that sees empty provincial newspaper newsrooms where there's one journalist who sits and reads all the PR handouts that come in from corporations, because corporations hire loads of journalists who can't get jobs in mainstream journalism, so they go and they work for PR agencies, which to me is, a great loss. But am I being too pessimistic about what's coming? Am I not seeing the opportunities? Am I part of that ancient group of journalists who yearned for a period when there were newspapers, when news journalists and editors decided what was good for people and that's what they read? I mean, is that the danger? Is there a massive generation gap on this issue?
No, I mean, I think we are facing challenges. I'd be lying if we weren't to say we weren't facing challenges, to say that, yes, resources are slimmer, yes, we are trying to do more with less, everybody's trying to do more with less, and that has its dangers. But I do think there is an effort to still produce quality journalism. It might be, and to still have in-depth research and to still break stories. And I think if it's a subscription model, whether it's the one Mark described, or whatever subscription model, I think that if that has to be the model, that will motivate quality journalism, because I think, as I said earlier, if some people will only want to pay for what's really good and not what they can get for free anywhere. So I think that gives me hope in terms of that's a really good motivator for news organisations to produce and put money and time into good quality work. But it is a struggle, and we are in a period of flux. So it's not clear where it's going to go. But I have to be hopeful.
Okay, and on that hopeful note, I want to say thank you so much to our panel this morning and to everybody for coming.